Hello everyone, my name is John Laffey. I'd like to thank you all for joining me today. I'm going to be giving a presentation on some fundamental concepts for ISO 27001 and developing your ISMS. Just wait another half minute or so here until it's 11 o'clock to make sure everybody that wanted to join is here, and then we'll get started. All right, so again, this presentation is fundamental concepts for ISO 27001. I am John Laffey. I am the program manager for our ISO 27001 program here at PJR. And thank you very much for joining me today. Let's get to it. Just a few notes before we get started. All participants have been muted for clarity. The slides from the presentation today will be available shortly from our website, pjr.com. If you click the training link, and then there you'll see a past webinar slides link that will link you to all of our webinars that we give here and the slide decks for them. Additionally, a recording of this webinar and all of our other webinars that have been presented will be available for review on YouTube. If you just search for Perry Johnson Registrars, you'll see we have a channel, and all of our webinar recordings can be viewed there for free. All right, so today, the specific topics we're going to be looking at, we're going to start by talking about defining your scope per the requirements of ISO 27001, as well as the effect your scope can have on your certification audit. We're also going to take a look at risk assessment and treatment, statement of applicability, and how all those concepts fit together. We're going to talk about information assets, specifically what they are and what you need to do with them according to the standard. And I'm also going to spend a little time talking about how you address hosted infrastructure and services as a part of your ISMS, just because I see it a lot and they're so prevalent today with businesses using hosted services, either entirely or in part that is part of their main information processing systems. And then at the end, any questions that you may have, I will be happy to answer as best I can. If you want throughout the presentation, you can go ahead and ask questions in the questions tab, and then at the end I'll pull that up and I'll work through them in the order they came. Hopefully we can have some good question and answer dialogue. All right, scope definition. So what does the standard require? It requires that the organization shall determine the boundaries and applicability of the information security management system in order to establish its scope. Additionally, the standard requires that the organization consider the external and internal issues that are relevant to the organization's purpose and that affect its ability to achieve the intended outcomes of its ISMS, the information security related requirements of the organization's interested parties, and the interfaces and dependencies between activities performed by the organization and those that are performed by other organizations. And then lastly, the standard requires that the scope be available as documented information. So let's go ahead and take a closer look at those requirements, and hopefully I can provide some a little bit more practical examples to help you understand exactly what the standard's getting at. So the standard says the organization shall determine the boundaries and applicability of the information security management system to establish its scope. So the types of boundaries that should be determined include physical, informational, and organizational. Physical boundaries are typically addresses of offices or buildings where the organization's activities are carried out. Informational boundaries would be defined by the specific information handled by the organization that is desired to be in scope of the ISMS. This could very well be all of the information an organization handles as well. And then organizational boundaries. Are there only specific departments or functions included in the scope? You want to be sure to define all of these boundaries clearly. Additionally, the standard requires that organizations consider the external and internal issues that are relevant to the organization's purpose and that affect its ability to achieve the intended outcomes of its ISMS. So some examples. An example of an external issue would be legislative and regulatory requirements applicable to the industry or region you or your customers reside in. Specifically, GDPR would be an example of an external issue relevant to an organization that collects information about individuals who live in the EU as part of their operations. An example of an internal issue would be something related to what the purpose of the organization is. More specifically, if an organization develops software that it sells, utilizing outsourced developers could be an internal issue that is relevant to both the organization's purpose and its ability to achieve the intended outcomes of the ISMS. The standard also requires the information security related requirements of the organization's interested parties to be considered. So an interested party is defined as a person or organization that can affect, be affected by, or perceive themselves to be affected by a decision or activity. And that's how it's defined in ISO 27000. Some examples of interested parties and their information security related requirements include owners of an organization who may require that no information security related breaches take place that could cause financial and reputational damages to the company. A regulatory body that may require that information security related legislation such as HIPAA be adhered to. Another example would be customers of an organization who may require that the organization safeguard the confidential or personal information disclosed to the organization as part of the goods or services being provided. And then lastly, it talks about the interfaces and dependencies between activities performed by the organization and those that are performed by other organizations. So in most modern information systems, there will be portions that are provided by a third party. An example would be an internet provider. In this example, it is expected that the organization would be able to identify the points of demarcation between its internally managed systems and the provider's internet connection and account for any risks that may arise from the company receiving information across this link and the inability for the organization to directly control or monitor, the myriad of devices the information may pass through on its route from the sender. So if a company is soliciting information, it may be personally identifiable, it may be confidential, and if they're asking it to be sent, over the internet, they should be able to provide some type of encryption or other safeguard to help mitigate the risk of potentially sensitive information traveling over public internet links. I mean, again, it's going to depend on specifically what the company does and the information they're asking for, but it should certainly be something that's considered in the risk assessment, and then assessed for how big of a risk the company thinks it is, and if needed, treated down to an acceptable level. The risks that arise from such interfaces and the treatment options available to the organization are going to be different from risks related to systems that the organization has control of, but they still must be considered and addressed. Again, that's basically, I'm just trying to make the point that you're going to have less control over things like an internet connection that are provided by a third party, where you don't manage all the devices, that information could travel across. So you have no real guarantee that there's not a chance that it could be intercepted by unauthorized users. And then, of course, the standard requires that the scope be available as documented information. So documented information could include written descriptions, charts and diagrams, network maps, lists, or any other method of describing the scope of the ISMS. But it must be available as documented information, and it must be controlled per the requirements of the standard in clause 7.5. So let's talk a little bit about the impact the scope could have on your certification audit. The definition of the scope is going to include the locations and number of people under the organization's control that are included in the ISMS. The primary drivers of determining the duration of your certification audit are the risk level of the activities being performed, the complexity of the ISMS, and the number of in-scope employees and locations. So the best recommendation I can give is that if you are going to be seeking certification, you contact a registrar as early on in the process of planning and implementing the ISMS as possible, because ultimately they're going to be the ones that you're going to need to be in agreement with as far as the appropriateness of your scope and what kind of impact that's going to have on the duration and resources required to conduct the certification audit. All right. Next, we're going to talk about the risk assessment, treatment, and statement of applicability. The standard requires that an information security risk assessment process be defined and applied that includes the risk acceptance criteria, as well as the criteria for performing information security risk assessments. Additionally, the standard requires that this process will result in an output of identifying risks within the scope of the ISMS, identifying the owners of those risks, and then analyzing the potential consequences and likelihood of the risk actually taking place, and prioritizing the treatment of those risks based on that information. So after the risks have been identified, analyzed, and prioritized for treatment, the organization must utilize the treatment process and apply it to any unacceptable levels of risk identified. So this is when you're actually going to be, doing whatever it is that's required to treat those risks, whether it be training for staff, whether it be purchasing new appliances, vulnerability scanners, firewalls, hardening security in any number of ways, purchasing new access systems for door locks. I mean, it goes on and on, but the treatment process is actually doing those things. Part of this process must also include determining all the necessary controls that require implementation in order to treat the risks. And in the standard itself, there's an Annex A section, which contains a comprehensive list of controls. So while you're going through the assessment and treatment process, you must refer to this list and make sure that if any of those controls listed in Annex A are applicable to your organization and could help you reduce your information security risks, that they be selected and implemented. After referencing the list of controls in Annex A and determining all that are necessary, you basically can create your statement of applicability. The statement of applicability, or SOA, is required to document all of the controls from Annex A, justification for inclusion, status of implementation, and justification for exclusion if necessary. And I have an example excerpt from a potential statement of applicability. So as you can see on the leftmost column, it's the controls. So we're looking at the controls in 8.8 here. The next column, it shows the justification for inclusion. So you'll see for the first control classification of information, the justification was risk assessment results. So basically that said during the risk assessment, things were identified that basically it was determined that, hey, if we classify information, so if we have specific handling procedures, different controls around different levels of sensitivity of data, it could reduce risks to, say, I don't know, for example, if you handle confidential information of another company, so a client's confidential information, you'd want to make sure that folks in your organization can identify what that looks like and know, hey, this can't be left out in the open. You don't walk out of the office with this. This needs to be shredded, things of that nature. The implementation status column. So for this first control, we see it has been implemented and it refers to policy XYZ. So basically, practically that would mean we have a policy that outlines what our information classification, what the different levels are and what's required to be done with the different levels of information classifications. And this is how we do it. And then the last column would be an exclusion justification. So you can see that there is no excluded controls in this sample. But for instance, there are some controls that deal specifically with software development. And if you're an organization that doesn't do software development, it would be expected that those controls might be excluded. And the justification for the exclusion could simply be, we don't develop software. It's not a part of our business. We don't have third parties develop software for us. It's just not what we do. So this is just a sample excerpt from kind of a typical statement of applicability. So what it actually looks like. So to summarize, your risk assessment identifies the information security risks that require treatment. when determining the controls necessary to treat your risk to an acceptable level, you must reference all of the controls listed in Annex A and document if they are applicable to you, justify their exclusion or inclusion, and reference their current implementation status. The document that you record this information on becomes your statement of applicability. Additionally, you want to make sure your statement of applicability is properly controlled and obviously can be identified by revision and date, because that actually is something that will go on your certificate if you become certified for your ISMS. It will have the brief kind of scope statement, and then it will also say, it will also list a statement of applicability, revision, and date. Basically, in the event that a company has a drastic change in, maybe a number of controls they've decided to exclude at a certain point in time, we want to make sure that we can identify on the certificate what version of the statement of applicability we saw to indicate, which controls were applicable at that time. All right, moving on. Information assets. So what are they, and what does the standard require you to do with them? Information assets are comprised of the information an organization handles or processes, as well as the supporting information systems that are utilized for the processing, storage, and transmission of this information. Information assets can additionally include people, as well as hardware, software, and networking equipment. Identifying and determining the value of information assets in terms of criticality to business operations is a key component of an effective risk assessment. Determining an asset's value not just by the cost of procurement, or what the receipt says, but by the criticality to the organization, allows risks related to that asset to be properly evaluated for treatment. It would make sense that if you have the same risks identified and one set of those risks is related to the main operating system of your company, that those would be treated with a higher priority than those same risks that would be related to maybe a separate internal system that a company uses to display upcoming holidays or birthdays on TVs throughout the office. So you would expect that the risks related to the main operating system that a company relies on to conduct business would be treated with greater urgency than those related to maybe an internal messaging system. The standard also requires that an inventory of information assets is drawn up and maintained, and that assets in the inventory have a designated owner. The asset owner should ensure that the asset is inventoried, has appropriate classification, and define the access restrictions and proper handling procedures for the information that resides on that asset or that passes through it. A benefit of identifying all of your information assets is to ensure that when you conduct your risk assessment, you're taking into account all of the identified information assets and not overlooking any systems or potential threat vectors. And to kind of speak a little bit more to that, I think it's possible. I think anybody here could say, there's a good chance they may not be able to tell you every single system, computer, server, et cetera, that exists in their organization, let alone what information specifically may be, hiding in some folder on a system that hasn't been looked at in 5 years. So when you do this inventory, it gives you the ability to make sure you're clear on exactly what it is your organization is in possession of. That way you can identify any requirements, information security related around those information assets and make sure that you're complying with them. By having asset owners assigned who are knowledgeable and familiar with the information assets and the role they play in the organization overall, you have a great list of resources to consult with when conducting your risk assessment. Having a comprehensive and complete list of your assets also provides clarity and confidence in knowing exactly what information your organization has in possession, ensuring you can identify all applicable information security related requirements to this information. Okay, hosted services and infrastructure and how to address them in your ISMS. So utilizing third-party hosted services and infrastructure as part of an organization's systems has become common practice for many companies. In some cases, the majority of an organization's information systems and processing may be taking place on these third-party provided platforms. In terms of ISO 27001 and its requirements, the most important thing to understand is that the organization is still responsible and required to ensure the protection of the information being processed and stored on these systems. So basically, you can't outsource your information security by saying, "Hey, we pay for these hosted services, so it's not our responsibility." It's possible that you may have a company that does actually carry out information security related activities on your behalf, but simply saying that all of our information is in Microsoft Azure's cloud, so we're not responsible for the security of it, is not acceptable. While an on-site visit to the third party's facilities is not typically feasible or appropriate for the certification audit, you should be prepared to demonstrate whatever due diligence you and your organization has conducted in order to have confidence that the third-party platform is meeting your information security requirements. There are also controls that specifically speak to suppliers to the information security system and monitoring and measuring their performance, as well as ensuring that information security related requirements are clearly spelled out and agreed upon in contracts or agreements. And I can say from my experience, I typically look to these agreements or contracts with third-party providers when I'm auditing a client. I want them to point out where their information security requirements are being spelled out and agreed to being met in those contracts or agreements. Additionally, you should be prepared to demonstrate what controls you have implemented and are responsible for as they apply to your hosted platform. For example, if a third party is providing you with hosted infrastructure, it is still expected that you are considering all of the controls in Annex A. A more specific example would be related to physical security at the third party owned facilities where the systems you are utilizing are physically housed. You still must determine what your organization's requirements are in terms of physical security and be able to demonstrate how you are ensuring that they're being met by the third party. So if you require that facilities are secured, by physical access controls, that cabling to your equipment is secured from outside tampering, if there needs to be a guard of some type in place controlling access to the facility, things of that nature, etc., you still need to determine what those requirements are and make sure that whatever third party you may be utilizing for your systems is meeting those requirements. So as an organization seeking ISO 27001 certification, you must still be responsible for and be able to demonstrate the manner in which information security threats are being identified and treated, whether it be on systems you own or on those provided by third parties. And that some kind of common things that I see in terms of third-party hosted services in ISMS auditing, aside from looking at contracts, many times SOC reports will be available. A lot of hosting companies provide those to their clients on an annual basis, and those can speak directly to the level of controls in place in regards to information security. Some clients will actually do site visits, kind of second-party audits of these facilities to make sure that everything that the hosted provider is saying they're doing is actually being done. So there's a number of different things that can be done in order to demonstrate that you've done your due diligence and are confident that the third party is meeting your information security related requirements. Okay. So that brings us to the end of the presentation. So I want to go ahead now and take some time to answer some questions, but I would like to just remind you guys that you can download these slides and view a recording of the webinar at our website, pjr.com. Additionally, you can feel free to contact me at jlaffey@pjr.com. All right, so let me pull up the questions here. I'm gonna pop this out. Bear with me. All right, so we have a question here from Beth. Is determining the value of an asset the same as classifying information assets? So Beth, no, I don't think they're necessarily the same thing. I think when you're determining the value of an asset, it could definitely take into account the classification of information that resides on it. So a better way to explain it might be, let's say that a company may have two different storage arrays, and one has encryption enabled on it at all times, and it's configured that any information that contains social security numbers has to be on that storage array. And then there might be another cheaper storage array that it doesn't have encryption, and it's just meant for kind of unclassified or public documents that there's no real sensitivity or risk related to those documents potentially being leaked to the public. So I hope that helps answer that question. But just to circle back on it, so I would imagine that in terms of criticality to the system, that storage array that's used to house that sensitive data, that would have a higher value because it's going to have more sensitive assets on it, and there'd be a higher level of risk associated with something happening that would expose the information on that more sensitive storage array. All right, another question here from Michael. Are there any standards for data classification types? Where can I find more info on data classification? Michael, I'm sure there is. I want to say for sure, I think NIST has published some guidance documents on information classification. But the easiest way is going to be to just go ahead and jump on Google and go ahead and search for information classification, methods, recommendations, guidance, anything of that nature, and I'm sure there'll be no shortage of information on the topic. Oh, my pleasure, Mike. So again, I'm just gonna stay online here for another 5 minutes or so and see if there's any more questions. But please feel free to ask away, and I'll do my best to answer. Otherwise, I appreciate everybody joining me today. I hope you got some good information out of the presentation. Oh, here we go. Another question from Beth. Beth's asking, in a risk assessment, do you have to take into account all identified information assets? Yeah, definitely, Beth. You certainly should. I mean, whether or not there is going to be risk associated with every single asset, I wouldn't expect necessarily that to be the case, but you definitely need to take them into consideration. The whole idea is that you don't want, something to happen because you overlooked it or didn't consider it. I mean, this is the time to take into account everything you can to make sure that, you're identifying any and all risks that may exist. Obviously, there's a ton, and it changes on an hourly basis, it seems, in the digital landscape, but you certainly don't want, anything to happen because it was omitted, especially after you've identified something as an asset. Okay, let's see. Mike here is asking where the slide deck is on the site. Mike, I don't think it's posted just yet. Typically, they'll have it posted within a day of the presentation taking place. So I would expect by tomorrow that the slide deck will be up on our site for download. Another follow-up from Beth. You don't have to treat them all, but you need to consider them. Well, so Beth, yeah, potentially they don't all need to be treated. Basically, you have to determine what your acceptable level of risk is. And you also have to determine, how you quantify risk. But to give a basic example, let's say that for each risk you have a scale of 1 to 5 of impact. So like impact level of 1 would be, it's not really a big deal. It's not going to do any real damage to the company. And an impact level of 5 would be, wow, we may go out of business as a result of this having taken place. And then you might have a scale of 1 to 5 for likeliness or likelihood. So that's just how likely is that to actually take place. And maybe you multiply the two values together, and that's how you get your risk level. And you could say, I don't know, we've determined that anything over a risk level of 10 requires treatment. So then when you actually go through and analyze all of your risks, if there's risks that are over a level of 10, you're going to need to do something to get that risk level at or beneath 10, so to make it acceptable. So I hope that helps answer that question, Beth. Another follow-up here from Mike, asking, when do you call the registrar? So Mike, you can reach out to the registrar, honestly. I don't think it can be too early, because I think a lot of actually becoming certified, there's a lot of questions about, what's this going to take? What's it going to cost? So, I mean, I think you should probably have an idea of what your scope is, because that information is going to be needed by the registrar in order to provide you with the answers that are going to help you, be able to figure out exactly what it's going to take. But, it's never too soon. I mean, I can tell you at PJR, we're never going to, we're always going to try and help you as much as we can, no matter how early on in the process. So it doesn't hurt to call and at least find out. All right, so question here from Kristen, who's a consultant, it looks like. How do you help a client determine scope? What questions to ask? It can be challenging to determine people and locations in initial scope. Kristen, it certainly can. I think the best way to do it is to start from the point of view of the information the company handles that you're trying to secure, and then looking at who handles that information, what systems is that information stored on, how is it transmitted. That's going to give you an idea of the people and systems that would need to be in scope. I don't know if that's the only way, but in my experience, because I know it can be challenging to determine the scope, I think starting with the information can really shed light on exactly the people and systems that need to be included because they're associated with that information. Okay. If there's no more questions, guys, I just again would like to thank everybody for joining us today. And again, these slides should be posted within a day on our site at pjr.com. So please feel free to visit us there. And if anybody, again, is considering becoming certified in ISO 27001, you can give us a call at 1-800-800-7910, and we'll be able to put you in touch with whatever resource it is that you may need, whether it's a coordinator, someone who can actually assist with getting the logistics of the scheduling the audit set up, or a technical resource such as myself. Obviously, we can't consult, but I certainly would be happy to help as much as I can, stopping short of telling you specifically what you should do. That's obviously where the line's drawn, but I'd be happy to help as much as possible. So don't hesitate to reach out to us and give us a call. All right, guys. Well, thanks again, and I hope you all have a great weekend, and hopefully we'll be talking to you soon.